"Enough, Susan!" my mom shouted, her voice shaking with frustration as she leaned forward, glaring at me across the table. The ornaments on the Christmas tree shimmered under the dim glow of the living room lights, but the festive warmth in the room felt like a cruel joke. I sat frozen, my hands gripping my lap, trying to steady the anger bubbling inside me. My dad chimed in, his tone just as sharp. "You've always had a way of making everything about you." The words hit harder than I expected, and for a moment all I could hear was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. My name is Susan Blanchard. I was 32 years old then, and this all happened in the late 1970s. It was a time when families relied on each other, especially out here in rural Illinois. Our family farm, passed down for generations, was the center of our lives, but it was struggling to stay afloat. I had moved to Chicago years earlier, becoming a lawyer, a decision my parents still saw as an act of rebellion against our way of life. Meanwhile, my older brother Jake stayed behind, running the farm and basking in the glow of their constant praise. I didn't resent him for staying. I resented how, no matter what I did, I was always the outsider. Since the summer, I'd been quietly sending money to the farm's shared account, trying to help with the bills Jake told me were piling up. He convinced me not to tell our parents, saying it would hurt their pride and make them feel like they'd failed. At the time, it made sense. I didn't want to embarrass them, and I trusted Jake to handle it. But sitting there on Christmas Eve, listening to our parents go on about how Jake had been sacrificing so much to keep the farm afloat, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I realized right then that he had been taking credit for every dollar I'd sent. "Jake's the reason we've been able to keep things going," my mom said, her voice thick with pride. "I don't know what we'd do without him." I looked across the room at him, expecting maybe some kind of acknowledgement or guilt in his eyes. But he just smirked, leaning back in his chair like he was enjoying the show. That was when I finally spoke up. "Actually," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the chatter, "I've been the one sending the money, every month since July." My dad scoffed, shaking his head as if I had just said the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. "Don't start making things up, Susan. Jake's been here day in and day out, working his tail off for this family. Why would you even say something like that?" His words stung, but it was the dismissive tone that really got to me. My mom crossed her arms and added, "You've always had a habit of trying to make yourself the center of attention. Honestly, Susan, it's Christmas. Can we not ruin the evening with this nonsense?" I felt my face flush, a mix of anger and humiliation coursing through me. "I'm not making it up," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I've been depositing money at the Chicago branch of the bank directly into the farm account. Every single deposit came from me. But they weren't even listening." My dad waved me off with a look of exasperation, and my mom turned her attention to Jake, who just shrugged like he didn't have a clue what I was talking about. The frustration was unbearable, and I realized there was no convincing them in that moment. They had already made up their minds. I turned to Jake, my voice sharp. "Are you really going to sit there and lie about it, Jake? You know I've been making those deposits at the Chicago branch all these months." He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking as if this was all some kind of joke. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Susan," he said with a shrug, his tone dripping with fake innocence. My blood boiled. "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head. But our parents didn't even seem to care. My dad sighed heavily, as if I were the one ruining the evening, and my mom gave Jake a sympathetic glance, as though he were the victim of some absurd accusation. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and looked directly at Jake. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "Those deposits weren't small, Jake. You've been sitting here, letting our parents believe you're some kind of hero when you've done nothing but lie. If you don't admit it now, I'll leave first thing tomorrow, go back to Chicago, and get the proof myself." Jake shrugged, leaning back as if none of this mattered. "You're wasting your time, Susan," he said with a chuckle. "Whatever story you've cooked up in your head, you go right ahead and prove it." It was in that moment I realized Jake didn't think I'd actually do it. To him, this was just another one of those family arguments that would blow over, where I'd eventually give up and let him win, like always. His smirk said it all. He thought I'd back down, too afraid of the fallout to follow through. But that only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to let him keep getting away with this. Not this time. He'd taken advantage of me, lied to our parents, and sat there soaking up their praise, all while treating my contributions like they didn't exist. No, I was going to Chicago, and I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. Early the next morning, I packed my bags, unable to face another moment in that house. I told our parents I was leaving, and predictably, my mom sighed, her voice heavy with disapproval. "It's Christmas, Susan," she said, as if I were the one ruining everything. My dad didn't even look up from his coffee. "Can't go a single holiday without causing a scene," he muttered. Jake barely hid his grin, lounging smugly in his chair like he'd won. But I wasn't staying, not with everyone acting like I was the problem. I knew the banks would be closed, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there, away from their judgment and his lies. The drive back to Chicago felt endless, the roads eerily quiet, with most people home celebrating with their families. I gripped the wheel tightly, the cold winter air seeping into the car despite the heater blasting. My thoughts churned, replaying everything that had happened the night before. Jake really didn't think I'd go through with it. That much was clear. He probably expected me to stew in silence, too intimidated by our parents' blind faith in him to actually leave. But this time was different. I was tired of being dismissed, tired of letting him walk all over me. As I drove past snow-covered fields and frozen lakes, one thing was certain. I'd get those receipts, and I'd make sure the truth came out. When the banks reopened a few days later, I went straight to the Chicago branch. It was bitterly cold that morning, the kind of cold that stung your face and made every breath feel sharp. As soon as I stepped inside, I headed straight to the counter, where a middle-aged teller greeted me with a polite smile. "Good morning," he said. "What can I help you with today?" I explained, carefully but firmly, that I needed copies of every deposit I had made to the Blanchard farm account since July. The teller nodded and went to the back, returning with a thick ledger and a small machine that printed receipts. He carefully looked up the account and began feeding each record into the machine, which whirred and clicked as it printed out copies of the transactions. I watched each receipt come out, one after the other, with my name, the dates, and the amounts clearly listed. He handed me the stack with a polite, "Here you go, ma'am. Let us know if there's anything else you need." I thanked him, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the receipts. They were more than just pieces of paper. They were proof. Proof that Jake had been lying, and proof that I wasn't going to let this slide. As soon as I had the receipts in hand, I headed straight back to my car. The roads were still slick from the snowstorm earlier in the week, but I didn't care. I needed to get back home, and I wasn't about to wait another day. The receipts sat on the passenger seat next to me, neatly stacked and secured under a small paperweight I'd grabbed from my desk before leaving. Every time I glanced at them, my anger bubbled up again. I couldn't believe Jake thought he could get away with this, and worse, that our parents had so readily taken his side. The drive felt longer this time, the farm seeming farther away with every passing mile. As I passed through quiet towns and frozen fields, my thoughts raced. I replayed every conversation from Christmas Eve, every dismissive look, every smug grin on Jake's face. By the time I pulled into the long driveway leading up to the farmhouse, the adrenaline had built up so much that my hands were practically shaking. I wasn't sure how this was going to go, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't leaving until they saw the truth with their own eyes. I walked into the house, the receipts clutched tightly in my hand, the cold from outside still clinging to my coat. My mom was in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, while my dad sat in his usual spot at the dining table, reading the paper. Jake was leaning against the counter, casually eating an apple, looking as smug as ever. They all turned to look at me as I entered, but before anyone could say a word, I dropped the stack of receipts onto the table in front of my dad. "There," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Every deposit I've made to the farm account since July. It's all right there. My name, the dates, the amounts." My dad put down his paper, frowning as he picked up the receipts and started looking through them. My mom came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression skeptical at first. Jake didn't move from his spot, but I caught the way his smirk faltered for just a second. This can't be right," my dad muttered, flipping through the pages. "Why would you do this, Susan?" My mom's eyes narrowed as she leaned in to see for herself. "Jake said he's been covering everything," she said, her voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. I turned to Jake, meeting his gaze head-on. "Well, Jake?" I asked, my tone sharp. "Are you still going to lie about it now?" Jake let out a laugh, tossing the core of his apple into the trash like none of this mattered. "Susan, I don't know where you got those, but they're not real. You probably forged them somehow to make me look bad." His tone was calm, almost mocking, and it made my stomach churn. I looked at our parents, expecting at least a flicker of doubt in their eyes, but instead, my dad shook his head, his face dark with disapproval. "Susan, what's gotten into you?" he said, his voice low and angry. "This is a new low, even for you." My mom grabbed the receipts from the table, holding them up as if they were tainted. "Did you think we wouldn't see through this?" she said, her voice shaking. "Jake's been here every day, working to keep this farm alive. And you—" She jabbed the stack of papers toward me. "You come back here with some phony papers and expect us to believe it? You've always been so desperate for attention." My chest felt tight as I struggled to hold back tears. "They're not fake," I said, my voice trembling. "You can call the bank yourself if you don't believe me." But they weren't listening. They stood there, united in their defense of Jake, like always, while I was left feeling like a stranger in my own family. I stood there, stunned, as my dad tossed the receipts onto the table like they were garbage. "I can't believe this," I said, my voice rising as the weight of their disbelief crushed me. "Even when I show you the proof, right here in black and white, you still defend him? This is unbelievable. I've spent months helping you keep this farm afloat, and all you've done is give Jake the credit and call me a liar." Jake crossed his arms, leaning against the counter with a smug expression that made my blood boil. "Don't be so dramatic, Susan," he said, shrugging like none of it mattered. "You've always been jealous. This isn't any different." I couldn't hold it in anymore. "You know what? I'm done. Don't expect me to ever come back here. I've had enough of this." My mom's face tightened and my dad just shook his head in disappointment, like I was the one in the wrong. Without another word, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it felt better than staying in that house for another second. By the time I got back to Chicago, I'd made up my mind. I was done. No more bending over backward for people who couldn't even bother to see the truth when it was right in front of them. The first thing I did after unpacking was call the bank and put a stop to the deposits. "No further transfers to that account," I told the teller, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside me. It felt strange, like cutting a cord that had tied me to the farm all these months. But it also felt freeing, like I was finally done carrying a burden that was never truly mine to bear. At first I thought I'd feel guilty, but I didn't. Every time I thought about Jake's smug face and our parents' refusal to believe me, it only reinforced my decision. Let Jake handle it now. Let him be the hero he pretended to be. I wasn't going to keep throwing money into a farm that treated me like an outsider. If they wanted to believe his lies, Then they could deal with the consequences when the bills started piling up. And they would. Because Jake didn't have a dime to his name. 6 months passed without a word from my family. Not a phone call, not a letter, nothing. I thought about them sometimes, but every time I did, the anger and hurt came rushing back, so I pushed it aside and focused on my work. Then, one afternoon in the middle of summer, there was a knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, I froze. Standing there were my mom and dad, looking tired and a little sheepish. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Can we come in?" my dad asked, his voice quieter than usual. My mom stood next to him, clutching her purse tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped aside and let them in. They sat awkwardly on the couch, looking around my small apartment like they didn't know what to do with themselves. "What do you want?" I finally asked, leaning against the armrest of a chair, my arms crossed. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. Whatever they had to say, I wanted it out in the open. My dad cleared his throat, staring at the floor like it might give him the words he needed. "Susan," he began, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We owe you an apology. A big one." My mom nodded, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "We were wrong," she said softly. "We didn't believe you when you tried to tell us the truth. And we need to make this right." I crossed my arms, leaning back against the chair. "Go on," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. My dad sighed heavily. "After you left, things started falling apart on the farm. Bills piled up, equipment needed repairs we couldn't afford, and the crops didn't bring in enough to keep us going. At first, we didn't understand and thought Jake had it handled. He kept telling us he'd figure it out. But he didn't. And when we pressed him, he finally confessed." My mom's eyes were brimming with tears as she spoke. "He admitted it, Susan. He told us you were the one making the deposits all those months, that you were the reason we stayed afloat. We couldn't believe it. Not just that he lied, but that we didn't listen to you when you tried to tell us." She reached out, her voice trembling. "We're sorry, Susan. Truly sorry. For not believing you, for how we treated you, for everything. You didn't deserve any of it." I looked at them, their faces lined with regret, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine shame. My dad finally met my eyes. "We're asking for your forgiveness, Susan. I know we don't deserve it, but we had to come here and tell you the truth. You saved the farm, and we owe you more than an apology." I sat there, staring at them for a moment, letting their words hang in the air. Part of me wanted to let the silence stretch on forever, make them sit with their guilt, but instead, I finally asked, "Where's Jake?" My voice was calm, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. My mom exchanged a nervous glance with my dad before she spoke. "He's still at the farm," she said quietly. "He wanted to come with us, but, well, we thought it was better if we spoke to you alone first." My dad nodded, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "He's been keeping to himself since he admitted everything. I think he knows there's no excuse for what he did. He's ashamed, Susan." "Ashamed?" I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "That's rich. Ashamed after months of letting you believe I was some kind of liar? After taking credit for everything I did to keep the farm running?" My dad looked down again, his face pale. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We let it go on far too long. It's on us as much as it is on him. But he wanted us to tell you that he's sorry. He said he doesn't expect you to forgive him, but he needed us to say it." "He said? He wanted you to tell me?" I snapped, leaning forward in my chair. "What are you talking about? You're still protecting him even now. He should be here apologizing in front of me. You should have forced him to come here." My voice echoed through the small apartment, and I could see the shock on their faces. But I didn't care. I was done tiptoeing around their favoritism. My mom opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. Do you even hear yourselves? He lies, he manipulates, he takes everything I did and twists it into some heroic story for himself. And now, when it's time to take responsibility, you're still shielding him? What? He's too embarrassed to face me, so you're here to clean up his mess again? Do you even realize how insane that sounds? My dad shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping his knees. We thought this would be easier for everyone, he muttered. Easier for who? I shot back. For Jake? For you? Because it sure as hell isn't easier for me. Neither of them said a word after that. My mom looked down at her hands, twisting the strap of her purse nervously, while my dad stared at the floor, his jaw tight. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally my dad stood up. You're right, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. We should have brought him. We should have made him face you. I don't know why we didn't. Maybe because we've been making excuses for him for so long it's just what we do. My mom followed his lead, standing up and clutching her purse to her chest. She looked at me with watery eyes, but there was no defense left in her. We're sorry, Susan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You deserved better from all of us. Without waiting for a response, they walked toward the door. My dad opened it, glancing back at me for just a moment, his face filled with regret. Then they were gone, the door clicking shut behind them. For a long time I just sat there, the weight of their shame hanging in the room like a ghost. They knew I was right, and for the first time in my life, it felt like they actually saw it too. A week later, there was another knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, my stomach turned. Jake was standing there, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, looking about as miserable as I'd ever seen him. Susan, he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Can I come in? For a moment, I thought about slamming the door in his face, but instead I stepped aside, letting him in without saying a word. He stood awkwardly in the middle of my living room, not sitting down, not taking off his jacket, just shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I came to apologize, he finally said, his eyes darting around like he couldn't bring himself to look at me. For everything, for lying, for taking credit for the money you sent, for letting Mom and Dad treat you the way they did. His voice cracked slightly, but I didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. I don't have an excuse. I was jealous of you, Susan. I've always been jealous. You've done so much with your life, and I stayed behind. I thought if I could just keep their approval, I'd feel, important, I guess. But it was wrong. All of it. Jake's voice broke completely, and before I could say anything, he dropped his head into his hands and started to cry. Big, heavy sobs that shook his whole body. It wasn't the kind of crying you fake. It was raw, filled with shame, and for the first time I saw just how broken he really was. He didn't try to hide it, and for a moment I just stood there, unsure of what to say or do. After that day, something shifted. My parents didn't call right away, but when they finally did, their tone was different. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, no trying to sugarcoat Jake's actions. It was clear they'd finally stopped protecting him. They didn't openly admit it, but I could tell they were treating him differently. My dad mentioned they'd started handling the farm finances themselves, and my mom let slip that Jake was working to make things right. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. As for Jake, he stayed out of my way after that apology. He didn't try to mend things too quickly, which was fine by me. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight, but knowing that my parents had finally seen him for who he was and acknowledged the hurt they'd caused me was enough to give me some peace. From that day on, even though things were never perfect in my family, At least they started being more fair.
Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.